It's kind of weird, isn't it? That combat is so important and so focused on when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, at the end of the day, Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game, right? Role-playing. It's about putting yourself in the role of a different character. You'd think with that concept, it would be more focused on social interaction, exploration, really focusing on figuring out who your character is. Role-playing. So why is it that combat is such a large focus of the game? I mean, the fact of the matter is, when people talk about Dungeons & Dragons, there's two things that they typically end up talking about. One, okay, here's my character and here's the cool stuff that's going on in the campaign, which I love hearing about, by the way. And then two, here's my character and the build that I'm playing. Here's the combat that happened. Here's, what happened in all the combat encounters. Isn't it weird that that's what's focused on in a role-playing game that supposedly has three pillars: social interactions, exploration, and combat encounters? Combat is so important. So why is that? Why has that become such a core part of this game and something that so many people are focused on? I mean, at the end of the day, the largest portion of the rules, the classes, are almost entirely focused on combat. I mean, the majority of them, about 95%, is only combat. So why is that? Well, let's talk about that. So when approaching these kinds of topics, it's inevitable and entirely unavoidable that I have to talk about earlier editions of D&D. When I talk about something that's important in the current state of D&D, we have to know the past. Context is everything. It's also inevitable when I talk about earlier editions of D&D that the D&D purists come out of the woodworks in order to tell me everything that I say is wrong. Look, I get it. I get that people want to correct me and make sure that I have my information right, and I actually genuinely appreciate that. But also on the other hand, I don't know if you guys know this, I'm relatively young when it comes to the majority of the actual D&D community, for at least, the people who've played previous editions. I didn't grow up with D&D. I grew up in a conservative Christian household. D&D was not something that was encouraged. So at the end of the day, I really haven't played a lot of the earlier D&D editions. Do I wish that I had? 100% absolutely. Am I going to play them? No, probably not. And it's not because I don't want to, it's because I'd have to learn an entirely new system while also working a full-time job and managing this YouTube channel on top of everything else I have going on. Simple fact of the matter is I don't have time for that. Maybe someday, but not anytime soon. So while I will try and talk about earlier editions, please know that, I'm going to get things wrong. And if you want to correct me in the comments, please absolutely do so. I love that people care about my videos enough to make sure that other people have the context for that. That is one of the greatest compliments you could possibly give me. But at the same time, please don't come at me for not knowing these things. I can only do so much research on this stuff without actually going and playing the game and learning the rules. I'm a very hands-on type of guy. So with those disclaimers out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it. Why is combat such a central part of D&D, even though it's touted as a role-playing game? Well, let's start with this. The very first edition of D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, just straight out of the box, no additions, it was the first of its kind, and I'm sure the creators assumed it would be the only of its kind. It was created, as a war game. It was actually based off of war games. So when it was created, it was pretty much focused on combat. In fact, the original editions of D&D, the earlier ones at least, were pretty much all about traveling, finding a dungeon, killing everything inside, figuring out how to get all of the loot back to your hometown. That was it. There wasn't much storytelling when it came to it. It was just about combat. In fact, one of the largest portions of the game was focused pretty largely on the fact of whether your characters would even survive. A far cry from the narrative-driven sort of games that we see today. And I've seen people in my comments before tell me that I'm wrong. D&D is not supposed to be a storytelling thing, and people have corrupted it because Critical Role showed up and tried to make it this sort of story-based thing. Look, I'm not gonna lie, Critical Role actually did a large amount to create D&D into this sort of storytelling thing, but it was always moving towards the direction of storytelling. 5th edition is based on that. And if you want to argue with me on that, which I know people will, let's be honest, arguing is what they love to do, allow me to read from a paragraph directly from one of the first sections of the Player's Handbook of 5th edition. The Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game is about storytelling and worlds of swords and sorcery. It shares elements with childhood games of make-believe. Like those games, D&D is driven by imagination. It's about picturing the towering castle beneath the stormy night sky and imagining how a fantasy adventurer might react to the challenges and the scenes that are presented. That's from the first pages of the official Player's Handbook published by the people who make Dungeons & Dragons. So for those who will still argue with me in the comments, because it happens, everybody does eventually, I don't know what to tell you. I'm reading directly from the source. If you still have a problem with that, then I'm starting to think that maybe it's not Dungeons & Dragons that you're playing and you're just a little confused. Either way, the point is D&D was based off of war games. That's what it was kind of made to be, and it became a storytelling thing. So it makes sense that combat would be an important part of it. After all, if that's what it was built on, then yeah, of course it's going to be a core pillar of it. But that doesn't explain why, in a 5th edition, where storytelling is so emphasized, why combat tends to be so important. It's the majority of the Dungeon Master's Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual. In fact, let's be honest, it's kind of all of the Monster Manual because it's just monster stats to be able to fight. There are a few roleplay things in there, but for the most part, it's almost entirely just monster stats so that you can kill them. So yeah, combat is still super important, and that's because the game is kind of based on that, and while it has grown and evolved, combat remains the same, but that's just not the whole story. The truth is, the reason combat is so important is because when it comes to high fantasy adventuring, or fantasy adventuring in general, overcoming challenges through your own might is just a core aspect of it, beyond D&D. Think about any fantasy story that you have read. What ultimately ends up happening? The heroes overcome things through trickery or might. The Odyssey, Greek myths, Roman myths, medieval folklore, the Arthurian legends, they all fall back on the same thing. Heroes overcoming things through their own might. It's just the fact of the matter. It's what humans have done up until this point. For the largest portion of human history, the way to overcome a terrifying object was to fight it and vanquish it. So yeah, of course combat remains the most important part of this game. But even that isn't the full story, because at the end of the day, why do we play D&D? We want to tell a full, fun story. That's why I play, and why the majority of my audience, that I can tell, wants to play. But we also just want to feel like the hero, or the villain, or basically an important, powerful force in the story. How do you do that? Well, you fight what's in front of you. You overcome it. You show that you're stronger. It is human nature to want to prove that you are capable and powerful in a certain scenario. And at the end of the day, that's just how it goes. That's what the game is based around, us being these powerful heroes that are overcoming objects and challenges. So that's why combat remains a core pillar of the game. 1, combat was what the game was based off of. 2, all of the legends and fantasy and everything we've seen up until this point has been based off of overcoming challenges through might. And 3, we want to feel powerful. We want to feel like we are empowered to make changes in the world, and a lot of times that just comes through conflict. So is there a lesson to be learned from all this? I really do think so. Yes, humans want to overcome everything through conflict, but conflict is inevitable. It's actually a literal law of the universe. 2 opposing forces are going to cause friction. It's how it works. For one to overcome the other, there must be a confliction. But that being said, I think it's interesting to go ahead and take a look at this and realize that D&D is based around conflict, tabletop games are based around conflict, but the resolution is always coming to terms with reality. Whether it's the reality that you cannot face this foe, whether it's the reality that you can overcome them, whether it's the reality that the conflict is pointless. Coming to terms with reality is how you overcome a conflict. That's why tabletop games are so powerful for me. Because at the end of the day, it is a story curated by a bunch of people at a table who are all going through life, all overcoming struggles, dealing with what's going on in their personal life. The conflicts in the game will reflect what's going on in their life because people find things that they relate to. Even if the DM does not intend it, people will find things that they relate to in the game, and those conflicts will inevitably end up reflecting what's going on in their life. And the only way to overcome it is to face reality. Either they are strong enough to overcome it, either they are not strong enough yet to overcome it, but they have people there who can help them, or they have to realize that there is another way around it. And it's strange, but combat often reflects the things that we are currently dealing with. And isn't that strange? This dumb tabletop game with arbitrary rules helps basically contextualize what we're currently going through. But that's all honestly a pretty large tangent. At the end of the day, the reason combat is such a core part of D&D is because it's a core part of, well, humanity. It goes back into our legends, the original basis of D&D. It goes back into our nature. And so yeah, combat is fun and it's cool to feel like a hero in the middle of combat. It really is. But don't forget why combat ends up being so important, because humans naturally conflict with their problems in order to overcome them. And I think that's what makes us really special and cool. So go out into the world, make it your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day, and never forget to play a role. Thank ya. Come again.